Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a follow-up on my single-length adventure. Last year, I built a DIY set of single-length clubs. I actually used these Mizunos. These were some old T-Zoids that I got for $35 used, and basically Frankensteined them into a single-length set. I played them for a little while, gave them an honest shot, and I wanted to give you some conclusion or follow-up and also where that journey has gone to since. So the SparkNotes version was that it was a ton of fun. I learned a lot, but it wasn't ultimately very usable. And but I would say it sold me on the concept, and so I kind of graduated up to something a little bit more usable. To go into a little bit more detail, so I've actually got the pitching wedge here, and I do want to say that I'm actually really glad that I did this. Now, these heads are, maybe some would call them trashed, because they're probably not going to be usable for anything else in the future. But I learned a ton about golf clubs, golf club design, golf club building, how a whole set works together. It was a really, really good exercise for me to gain a lot of those skills, and just to understand how things balance and how things weigh and how things measure and how the angles all change throughout a set. There's a lot of moving pieces that goes into making a set of golf clubs. And so to try to bring it all together, it took a lot. You know, and in summary, you know, with every golf club that you typically have, let's say you start with your 7-iron, because it's maybe the goal of a single length set. Every time you go up to the 6, the 5, the 4-iron, you add an inch of length, and then you reduce the weight of the head by 7 grams. You also change the lie angle to be more and more flat. And you're also thinking about every time you add a little bit of inches to the length of the shaft, you're actually going to be adding club head speed. So that's going to change how the center of gravity is going to affect your launch and your spin, and vice versa. When you go down to the 8-9 pitching wedge, because your shaft is getting shorter, you got to add 7 grams of weight to each head. Again, as you're getting shorter, you're getting slower swing speed. But, you know, the whole thing really just plays together as a systematic unit. So to unify all those variables, it took a lot of tinkering. The shortcomings with the set. I got all of the specs right? So every head weighed the exact same. I used a 7-iron shaft, and I used an FS-Teen 115 gram steel shaft. Same grip. Everything was weighing exactly the same. They all had the same lie angle, and so the only really thing that was changing between each head was the loft, which I think was really interesting. And what I experienced was, so I had a 21-degree 3-iron all the way up to a 47-degree pitching wedge. I think there's maybe 3-degree gaps on the high end and then 4-degree gaps on the low end. And the 3 and the 4-iron were very unusable, meaning the 3-iron, it was like a stinger machine, where I actually would hit it like 160 yards carry, and then it would roll like 60 yards past that. So it was not a very usable club. I actually experimented a little bit with it as like a 2-iron off the tee type club, which was actually kind of fun, but also ultimately not super usable. But ultimately, what the problem was is they're basically a pure blade at that point, because I had used a lot of epoxy mixed together with tungsten weighting. That was how I weighted up those light, lower lofted clubs. And so it basically became a pure blade. There was no center of gravity relief at all to help me launch the ball in the air. And my club head speed really isn't maybe high enough to really make that work. So ultimately, those clubs were really, they were easy to hit from the perspective that it was 7-iron length. I experienced that to be true, but they were hard to hit because they're basically pure blades. On the other end, for example, with this pitching wedge, because I had bored out a lot of weight, what I really experienced was that I would launch the ball way too high. I would just hit these moon balls. And I also found that because I had removed some weight, they felt really weird and kind of hollow, and I think it was because I didn't take the weight off evenly across the club. There were little pockets of where I would drill things out versus not, and it just made the club feel really weird. So overall, the windows that I was hitting each shot was really kind of pretty messed up. The pitching wedge and 9-iron launched way too high, and then the low irons launched way too low. And ultimately, again, they were just pure blades, so they weren't very usable. So I would say, though, that they were a good introduction to the concept, and it helped me figure out that this is something that I'm interested in doing more of. So I graduated, and I decided to try out the Pinhawk single-length irons. And these are a DIY set, which I really liked. And when I got them, I actually removed the badging on the back cavity because I didn't think it looked very good. And then I actually torched them because they're made out of stainless steel. So like, you know, sometimes you'll see guys with their putters or their wedges, they will take a torch to it, and depending on how long and how hot you heat it, it kind of turns into shades of blue and purple and brown, and I think it actually looks really, really cool. So to talk a little bit more about these Pinhawk irons, they are a cavity back design. They remind me of something that like Callaway would have made, maybe in like the X12 or X14 series. So they're a little bit chunkier. They've got a pretty modest amount of offset, pretty thick top line, pretty rounded overall shape. They've got definitely a cavity back design with an undercut channel here, so some perimeter weighting. And they also don't have a lot of technology in them, meaning it's the same head design, whether it's the 5-iron, which is the lowest one that I've got, or whether it's the pitching wedge. It's the same style of head. The head design doesn't really change, but they're all the same weight. They're all the same lie angle, so I really don't have to do anything other than just take the shafts, those 7-iron shafts, FST 115s that I had in my Mizunos, and stick them onto the Pinhawks. So it's a pretty easy and seamless transition. And I felt like these irons actually were quite a bit better. The cavity back design made them a lot easier to hit. Now, they still suffer a little bit. The 5-iron is 25 degrees loft, and I wouldn't want to try the 4-iron at 20 or 21. But one interesting thing is they have big gaps. They have like 5-degree gaps between the 4, 5, 6-iron, and then they go to 4-degree gaps through the rest of the set, so that your long irons aren't bunching together. You know, like I said, my 3 and my 4-iron were very unusable because they didn't carry very high and they bunched. You know, if I got 140 carry with my 3-iron or 160 carry, I probably got 155 carry with the 4-iron. So they just didn't play very differently. Whereas the bigger spacing and gapping helps with these Pinhawks. So I get nice gapping between the 5 and 6 and 7-iron. Now, I would say the pitching wedge and the 9-iron still have a little bit of a tendency to launch pretty high up in the air, but it's not as bad. And I do think that when I remove the badging and their stainless steel clubs, they don't sound and feel super pure. Actually, underneath the badging was like this adhesive, and I think that that actually helped to kind of mute or deaden the feel in maybe an appreciable way, because now to be honest, they don't sound or feel that good. So they're not perfect. I don't really like the way that they look very much, but I will say that I hit them very well, and I think they are a really good expression of the single-length idea. They're very easy for me to hit and play. Some other thoughts that I have is the 5 and 6-iron, I have like a mental block that I just need to learn how to get over, and that's when I have like 185 or 190 yards to the pin, I have this tendency to want to swing harder because I feel like I have to kind of muscle the ball there, as opposed to making a normal swing and just trusting that the loft is going to get me there. I don't have a tremendous amount of club head speed, but that's definitely a flaw in my game, and actually I would say that's not a good... You probably really shouldn't be doing that with any of your clubs. You should be making a nice, stable swing all the time. But this has revealed that I try to kind of muscle the ball when I've got that 190 to 170 maybe range where I would hit those clubs. And that's definitely something that I need to kind of work on a little bit. But, you know, ultimately, though, and on top of that, I actually also added this Cobra F9 one-length 21-degree hybrid. And that was also really a trip to get used to because, again, it's this really short shaft, and so you kind of have to commit, I think. I think the single length requires that you give it some commitment. That's not something you could try for just a couple rounds to get the benefit. I think you need to commit to it for a period of time. So that's what I'm doing here at the beginning of the season. I'm going to commit to these irons, and I think these Pinhawks are awesome. They provide a really, really good value for dollar. They do have downsides, meaning they don't have a ton of tech. They don't feel or sound very good. They don't really look very good, but the playability-wise, they're awesome. So the last thing I want to comment on is it's interesting. You know, I've learned a lot about technology and center of gravity use, and I think one thing you see with the different single-length sets, especially if you look at Cobra, and how they have evolved from the F7 to the F8 to the F9 and wherever that now, and even some of the newer offerings like from Wishon, a lot of these manufacturers, they are making the length of the shaft single length, but then they use other, I'm going to call it tricks, to help with that launch problem, because I think that's really one of the hurdles, is just seeing that pitching wedge launch way too high and watch that 5-iron launch way too low. So a lot of them might experiment with different flex and bend profiles in their shafts. I know like Patterson and Cobra, I think, do that, where they might have like a, let's say, a 70-gram regular flex shaft in the 5 and 4 irons, but then the wedge might have like a 90 or 100-degree shaft that's stiff. And they use the flex of the shaft to kind of try and help with your launch angle. I also think that Cobra changes the lie angle a little bit, which I personally don't love. And then the other thing that you see from Wishon is they are using the head design and the springiness of the head. So for example, in the 5 and 6 and 4 irons, they will use hollow heads that are really springy. So think like a P790 style head to really get that hot ball speed off the face to give it a little bit more pop so it launches. And then the pitching wedge in 9-iron will be a little bit more of like a forged, not such a hollow, hot face iron like you might find with more of like a player's forged type club. So they're kind of getting the launch to work. And that's ultimately the evolution, I think, of the single length concept, is you have to use these other tricks in your bag. You know, if you're keeping the length the same and the head weight the same, you got to mess with your other variables to kind of fix those imperfections. And so that's kind of one of the other conclusions that I've drawn is I think a lot of people look at single length as a concept and they try to make it fit what they were doing with their variable length, but better. And I don't know if that's maybe an accurate goal. I think you kind of need to take single length as it is. And so like the launch windows, you know, to some extent that can be helped or fixed a little bit, but also it's just a little bit of a part of the deal. So that's kind of why I went to a hybrid and more of a cavity back design. And maybe at some point I'll graduate to a different one that can help solve that problem in a different way. But ultimately, I think you need to kind of take the single length concept as it is and just kind of learn to adapt to it's kind of got a different set of strengths and weaknesses. And so ultimately, I think that it's really worth it. And also one thing I would say is do what makes sense in your mind. And so, for example, for me, I found the most benefit with the 21 hybrid, the 5 and the 6-iron. Because like I said, it revealed that that was a weakness of my variable length set, is those long iron approaches. And whereas like I go down to a pitching wedge, but I keep my gap wedge, my sand wedge, my lob wedge variable length because I just don't feel very comfortable with those long wedges, and I have never struggled with that part of my game. So I think for me, I'm kind of picking and choosing. And I might even go so far at some point to try doing single length maybe for my 4, 5, 6, 7 irons, but then go variable again from 8 down to lob wedge, or however you want to do it. Or maybe even if you slot in one of these Cobra 1-length hybrids as kind of your fairway finder off the tee or something like that. I don't know, it might be kind of goofy, but it solves that problem because it provides its own set of strengths and weaknesses. And if for me, having the shorter long irons helped me be more consistent and more accurate, which I really like. So, I guess I would just want to give you guys the freedom to experiment and to play around with your set. And ultimately, some of these traditional concepts of set makeup, if they're not working for you, then they don't make sense. Not everybody needs to fit into the traditional rules of a set of golf clubs. Build something that works for you. And if it's not working, then feel free to experiment until you find something that does. And, so ultimately, I think I'm going to commit to this set of single lengths because I think that's the other thought. If you can groove your one swing, if you don't have a lot of time to practice, you just can go and bring your 7-iron and you're grooving the same swing you make with your pitching wedge versus your 5-iron. And I think that requires some commitment. So I'm really excited to see if I can do this for 2, 3, 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Can I get to a place where I've stabilized with my game and I can kind of focus on other areas? My ball striking is going to reach some more consistency, and I can maybe spend a little more time on my chipping and putting and driving. And I just have a lot of hopes there that can help me pay off. So overall, I would say this experiment was really worth it, and I would encourage you guys to feel free to experiment with stuff like this because you're going to learn a ton, and I think it's going to make you better, and it's going to make your set makeup better in the long run. So let me know your thoughts and comments down below. I'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.